Greetings, ladies and managers, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called The Demon's Call, written by Dark Prince 010. It wasn't that Deneb the Fell-Maned had never looked up to the stars. Quite the opposite, in fact. But it wasn't necessarily something that a demon of the burning sands would be interested in. Not when there were so many more pressing affairs at hand amongst the kingdoms of foolhardy men. He had been locked as a prisoner across several thousand years in various forms and containers. Once a ring, another time a lamp, and on multiple occasions a polished crystal of the size of a man's fist or larger. Each time, when his duties came, he was bound to the hopes that he could be compelled to perform miracles and wishes. This was, of course, an impossibility, a tale told to greedy wizards in the hopes that they would free more of his kin from their hellish plane of origin, to wreak havoc on the face of the world. So it was, and so it would always be. Or so Deneb had expected. So he was quite surprised to find that he had been summoned and bound to a new prison. This one was not made of crystal, cold iron, or gilded metal, but instead some sort of material that was hard to the touch and unyielding, like a clay pot, except infinitely stronger. After testing it with a scorching blast of infernal fire, he found that it was also able to weather his fiery power without even becoming warm. Interestingly, this new prison was not uniform in being only of ceramic, but instead also had a pane of fine, clear crystal, a sapphire or something of the ilk, set into one side of it. As a result, Deneb could see out of his prison and into the world. He was surprised to see a human in a white coat or tunic peering in at him. When he looked out, he saw the human's reaction was pleased, and they began speaking in tongue that the demon did not immediately understand. He concentrated for a moment, letting the magic flow through him until he felt the prickling of his pointed ears and signaled the completion of the spell. And he could hear the human voice clearly.
So I see it's a great success, and we're quite excited to see what you have to offer,
said the human. Deneb couldn't help but smile to himself. This was nothing new. Another human seeking to unleash the power of wishes, thinking him to be a genie or an efreet. But they would soon be disappointed and pay for their hubris and ignorance. Channeling magic to his tongue, he spoke in the same language as the man. What would you have me do for your first wish, master? To his surprise, the human in the coat smiled.
Oh, nothing. You're actually kind of just a bonus, but we'll be really interested in widening the portal to your home dimension through our holding vessel.
The Nib stared back, stunned. Well, perhaps some of the wizards and sorcerers in the past had shown some degree of control and didn't immediately wish for a boon from him. This was far different. He didn't desire any boons whatsoever. Additionally, the demon could see and feel behind him the tiny pinhole that connected him to his home plane began to widen until it was an aperture wide enough for him to stride through without issue. He knew that he could not actually escape, as this was part of the spell of binding to cut him off from his home plane. But before, it had felt like a vestige of a spell, a required gap that allowed him to peer through the tiny pinhole to see his home, but was minimized to the smallest size for safety and security. Now, it was wide enough that he could easily see through without straining or constriction, and he could feel a wonderful blast of unimaginable heat wash over him as he did so. Normally, this would have meant the destruction of any mere vessel of metal or even mortal stone and crystal, but whatever this pottery they had stored him in glowed but did not yield to the fires of his home plane. Behind him, the human was speaking again, apparently very pleased at the development.
Excellent! We have reached full operating temperature, and the heat sink is holding nicely. I think we're good to go to install this and launch early next week.
Deneb chuckled to himself at the thought of being put into an ocean-going ship in his prison's current state. At least the vessel would burn merrily, and he could watch it clearly through his window of crystal before it sank to the bottom of the ocean, and he had to spend another millennium entertaining himself until it was drenched up again. Instead, The foul demon watched as his container was placed within a vessel of steel and more of the ceramic. It stood pointed not into a sea, but towards the sky, the very vault of heaven itself. For the first time he could recall in tens of thousands of years, he felt the thrill of excitement at the unknown. The glowing ceramic jar was placed in the midst of a complex of pipes and tubes and thin-coated wires of the finest precious metals, and Deneb could see that the heat from his home plane was being channeled to help power and energize whatever construct this was. Voices began speaking, reading all preparations and countdowns, despite them not being uttered by the throats of man, but by more amalgamations of steel, silicon, and gold. He could also feel the scrutiny of the human watching it, until the man said, "I do appreciate you not making a fuss about this. We've had others of your kind that have been far less cooperative. I trust I can promise you that I shall make it worth your while if you continue helping us." Deneb said nothing, and instead watched out his window at the vessel. The ship of steel began to rumble and alight from the very earth itself. He could sense the presence of a mighty fire, a roaring inferno, almost equal to the heat of his home plane below him. But it was being used to thrust the ship forward, as one might use the breath of angels to fill the sails of a ship. After some time, the view changed from the blue sky to the black pinpricked cloak of stars, but Deneb knew that this was not from simple nightfall. Indeed, he could see the blue sphere dotted with shapes of the continents below. On one or two occasions, he himself had traveled above the bounds of Earth when his prisons had been shattered, simply to see what was there before returning for mischief, but never any further. Again, for the first time in tens of thousands of years, he felt the thrill of uncertainty, perhaps even fear of the unknown that they were venturing into. But even then, Deneb wanted to see what was out there beyond the world that he had known. Months passed and Deneb grew familiar with the crew. The scientist who had first bound him to his vessel was a man by the name of Suma, who others called an engineer as well. While the remainder of the crew typically gave a wide berth to his vessel and the containment room that it was trapped in, Deneb still learned about the others here. The crew was relatively small, according to Suma, perhaps 36 in total, and most of them were scientists or passengers intended for the final destination. Suma had not yet told him where they were going, saying only that it's a surprise you're likely to enjoy. But Deneb was so distracted by the wonders of the travel that he had forgotten to pursue this intriguing vagueness. On more than one occasion, the sky and stars around the flying ship he was connected to had rippled, and he saw that the view of his home plane within his prison had changed to be that of a different place, still within his home plane, but a different landscape unknown leagues distant. Suma had explained that they had used his planar rift, as he called it, to open an analogous rift in their entire vessel, using it to slip across a million miles at a time in a blink of an eye. As a result, Deneb had a chance to see magnificent shimmering nebulas and ponderous gas giants, sights and wonders he scarcely even imagined back in his limited time on Earth. But the ship's power did not require him in the slightest, only his prison. And as a result, he spent his days and nights, insofar as those existed this far away from the sun and moon, aimlessly watching the passing stars and the astronomical phenomena. Suma did make a point to visit daily, though, and Deneb soon found that this human was likely the least insufferable of any of the mages, sorcerers, and clever magicians he had known in his time. Suma even arranged for Deneb to be able to travel more freely about the ship, taking advantage of stored-up power in enormous batteries to power the ship, while he and his scalding prison were escorted through the ship in a carefully temperature-controlled secondary vessel. It did allow Deneb to see more of the vessel that he was placed within, and soon he felt familiar enough with it that he was able to sense its presence and the beings within without physically traveling through it. He quite enjoyed the first time he was able to successfully spook Suma, with writings in runes of eldritch blood on the man's bedside locker. Soon, he and Deneb would idle the days by with games of cards and dice. The effort needed to magically flip a card over or throw a knucklebone was extreme while still locked in his prison, but given his labor and energy was not being expended or granting inane wishes seekers, Deneb did not mind in the slightest. Then the day came when they were boarded. Things that were not human but had minds that were far too human stormed the vessel, firing weapons for fire and light, slaughtering many of the crew who had begun to accept the demon and even joined the occasional game of poker with him and Suma. He could only exert his influence here and there, with a puff of smoke to conceal the hiding crewmate or a minor magical barrier to deflect a single piece of shrapnel from another. His full might could have saved the entire ship and crew, but not while he was locked within his prison. So, as a result, Deneb the Foul-Maned, Deneb the Stargazer, as he had privately dubbed himself, could only watch with helpless fury as those humans who had become the closest things to friends a demon could ever truly experience lay dead or dying all around the vessel that he'd been installed into. The inhumane creatures examined the engine room, and using another surge of magic, Deneb adapted his ears yet again to understand their words and chittering. They recognized that there was a spirit within the engine, something that they saw as perverted, unnatural, and exceedingly dangerous. He overheard words of bombs and self-detonation and cleansing. But what caught his attention were words across the communicator that there was a human in the ventilation system, one who'd gotten away from the slaughter. His hearts were a frenzy, fiery blood pounding through his head. Somewhere, someone survived. He reached out through his ship, seeking whoever might have survived the slaughter. Hope against hope. He found that it was Suma, crouching behind one of the oxygen generators. But Deneb could tell that the man had suffered a fatal injury, blood and viscera oozing from the gaping and charred wound in his stomach. His power could have cauterized the wound, restored some vigor to him, but not in his current contained state. He pushed his essence behind the human's eyes, whispering within his mind, "I can save you. I can help you. Please let me." Uttering these words for the first time in his existence with sincerity. "Please let me help you." Suma smiled, not a grim smile, but one of genuine warmth and appreciation. But then he coughed, the smile fading as blood stained his lips. I appreciate it, but this vessel is doomed, and you do not deserve to be doomed along with it. Deneb knew that he, as a demon, was truly immortal, no more able to be killed than one could kill a star. But he did not interrupt Suma. Last breath filling his lungs, gasped, "I do wish to make a single wish, Deneb, if you will permit it." Deneb could feel the intrusion of the thrill of being able to twist a wish and turn it against his user. And while he tried to tamp it down, he could not any more than he could feel cold within his veins. "Anything, whatever it is, the most wondrous miracle shall be yours," he said with a practiced familiarity from years of saying the same sentence to many other men and women. But instead Suma just said, "I wish you to be free, my friend." The Vicarian raider stood as close to attention as he could, considering its injuries. The six-limbed alien was missing all but 3 limbs, one full set of arms and another supplemental arm having been sundered from its form. Blackened and scarred stumps marked where the injuries had been cauterized with little amount of force or heat.
"So you secured the vessel and cleansed it of the occupants after surmising that they had bound a world walker?"
the Queen asked the soldier. It was clear to her that this was a just decision, as her kind had ruled aeons ago that magic was too dangerous to meddle with, and even more dangerous to be channeled through improvised world walkers who wielded it as easily as one might breathe. "Yes, my Queen," the soldier replied. "We thought that it best to leave the world walker in its prison so that we could cleanse the vessel and destroy it utterly. But as we made it to the engine room, one of the surviving humans must have unleashed it from its containment cell. I managed to make it into a nearby escape shuttle and get away from the ship before it was consumed in fire. But it was like a tidal wave had rocked over everything within the sector. Even nearby worlds were scorched, gas behemoths lit like torches. Everything was consumed."
"And your craft was unharmed?" the Queen inquired.
It nodded. "Yes, my Queen. I was perfectly spared. I realized this both after seeing the explosion and when the World Walker itself entered my craft.
And?
The Queen was sitting on edge of her throne, hanging on to the soldier's every word. The World Walker delivered a single warning for me. After separating me from my arms, it said, I am Deneb the Fellmane, the Stargazer, and you will know me as Deneb, the Infinite Pyre. Make peace with whatever gods and spirits you hold dear, for I shall make you wish your kind had never dared to reach the stars above. The Queen shuddered, and in the coming days prepared the entire force of the Royal Armada and all the outlying splinter fleets to return to fortify their own world. It was not enough. It was not even a fraction enough to slow the being's rage. In the glow of what was once an entire homeworld, converted now to magmatic rock and billions of corpses, Deneb felt his rage replaced by an aching emptiness. The slaughter of the attackers didn't fill it, despite how naively he hoped it would. However, as he raged, destroyed uninhabited worlds and other minor colonies within the star system, he could feel something on the edge of his senses. His magic reaching his pointed ears heard the words of humans, not the language Suma spoke, but human tongue nonetheless. Following them, Deneb traveled in an instant through his home plane, temporarily luxuriating in the warmth that he had missed, emerging back out into real space millions of miles distant, as Suma and the other clever humans had once inadvertently shown him how to do so. At the end of its trail of voices, Deneb found a trade station, a chunky and inelegant hub with merchant ships coming and going. Humans, as well as things that were not human but did not threaten or kill them, filled every corner of the structure. Suddenly, like a drop of water within a parched desert, Deneb felt the tiniest fragment of a hole within him being soothed, if only for a brief millisecond. Summoning his magic to him, Deneb crafted a form of a human for himself. It resembled Suma, but only enough that one might think him a cousin rather than a twin. Stepping out of the concealed corner he had hidden himself within as he'd finished his spell, Deneb entered into the flow of the merchant hub of the trade station. He was immediately jostled and disoriented as he had been bumped and shuffled, surrounded by hundreds of bodies and a hubbub of noises and voices. Looking around to find his bearings, he looked up to see a glass viewport within the distant inky sky beyond. As Deneb gazed up at the stars, he finally felt peace again. End of story. I'd quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and patrons: Cam Maxwell, Casper Arnholtz, Bushmaster 177, Lord Azrakal, Ambrose Cattell, Quantum Wednesday, Trixoon WRE, and Blueberry Cat. Thank you very much for the support. It is super appreciated.